statues of gods that gleam with an unnatural brilliance. You walk through the imperial gardens, flowers heavy with perfume, the air silent but for the trickling of water from lion-headed fountains. And then you hear it, laughter echoing from Nero's private quarters. But it's not the laughter of lovers or friends. It is shrill, frantic, and desperate. Because inside those candlelit rooms, the Emperor of Rome is clinging to a corpse, whispering words only madness could form. The corpse is his wife, Poppaea Sabina, and what Nero does next, driven by grief, guilt, and an obsession twisted beyond recognition, will become one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in imperial history. A chapter that ends with the castration of a young boy named Sporus to create a living replica of the woman Nero destroyed with his own hands. Before we descend into this nightmare of broken identities and imperial insanity, if you find yourself captivated by these hidden and brutal truths of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me how we gather here from across the world, bound together by curiosity, compassion, and a desire to witness even the ugliest parts of our shared human past. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another Roman scandal. It's the story of how grief can curdle into madness, how love can become possession, and how one man's fantasy erased another human being's life forever. Let's begin with the emperor himself, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a man who, despite the darkness that now stains his memory, wasn't born a monster. When he ascended the throne at just 16 years old, LD, Rome buzzed with optimism. Here was a handsome, educated youth with artistic passions and philosophical training. He reduced taxes. He banned gladiatorial combat to the death, briefly, seeking more humane forms of entertainment. He even wrote poetry and performed music, sometimes humbling himself before crowds as if to say, "I am one of you." But absolute power corrupts absolutely. By 65 AD, Nero was no longer the charming boy king. He was a paranoid tyrant trapped in his own delusions, surrounded by sycophants, terrified to speak the truth. And in the middle of that gilded cage was Poppaea Sabina, the woman he called his goddess. Poppaea was unlike any other woman at court. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal. Her skin was said to glow like ivory. Her hair fell in golden coils. She knew exactly how to feed Nero's ego while guarding her own power. Some historians describe her as manipulative, others as pragmatic. But what's certain is that her beauty and her fearless ambition drove Nero to worship her with an intensity that bordered on religious madness. His obsession began when he was still married to Octavia, the dutiful daughter of Emperor Claudius. Compared to Poppaea, Octavia was quiet, dignified, and reserved. Nero found her presence suffocatingly bland. Poppaea was his opposite, vivacious, cunning, luxurious in taste and manner. Their affair began like many court scandals, with secret meetings and whispered promises, but it rapidly consumed him. Nero divorced Octavia without remorse, and to the horror of Rome, within weeks, he had her executed under false charges of adultery, all to clear the path for Poppaea. Their wedding was a spectacle of indulgence, with ivory sculptures, blood-red roses from Alexandria, and incense from Arabia so thick that guests wept from the smoke. But as the crowds cheered, Nero's mind was sinking deeper into the delusion that he could hold on to Poppaea forever, that she would never slip away from him as long as he controlled her completely. He built temples in her honor, minted coins with her image, and commissioned hundreds of statues so her face would gaze upon him in every chamber he entered. Yet even this wasn't enough, because Poppaea was not a silent ornament. She argued with him, she mocked his poetry when it was bad, she told him truths no one else dared whisper, and that, in the end, was her undoing. One night, Pregnant with their second child, Poppaea confronted Nero after he returned late from chariot races. The details vary between Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, but the outcome never changes. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, perhaps fueled by wine and humiliation at her scolding, Nero lashed out with a brutal kick to her belly. The marble floor of her chamber ran red with blood as she collapsed, clutching the life growing inside her. Within hours, both she and the unborn child were dead. Imagine the emperor's horror as he knelt by her lifeless body, tears mixing with the blood that smeared her golden hair. He had killed the only person he believed could truly love him. Ancient sources say he wailed like a child, kissing her cold lips and commanding her to wake as if his imperial power could reverse death itself. For days he refused to eat. He lay beside her embalmed corpse, stroking her cheeks and whispering apologies that dissolved into babbling nonsense. But grief can become something darker when it festers in the mind of a man who believes himself divine. For Nero, Poppaea's death didn't end his obsession. It deepened it into an abyss of madness. He refused to burn her body according to Roman custom, instead preserving her with costly resins and oils, building her a marble mausoleum greater than any emperor's tomb before her. He declared her a goddess and commanded the Senate to establish her cult. Yet worshipping her memory wasn't enough. The human heart, twisted by guilt, sumped. Imus demands resurrection. That was when Nero first noticed Sporus. Sporus was a teenage boy, perhaps 14 or 15, raised within the palace as a slave and freedman. He was educated, intelligent, and obedient, a youth trained for clerical service and personal attendance. But none of these qualities drew Nero's gaze. What drew him was Sporus's face, delicate bone structure, large dark eyes, and a sweetness of expression that mirrored the dead Poppaea so precisely it seemed as if the gods themselves had carved him to torment the emperor with a living reflection. When Nero looked at Sporus, he didn't see a boy. He saw a second chance to hold his dead wife again. But there was one problem. Sporus was male, and for an emperor who believed no law or moral code bound him, that problem became an opportunity to assert his power over nature itself. What Nero did next would become one of the most calculated and cruel acts of identity erasure in human history. What Nero did next was not a decision born of love or even grief. It was born of possession. The same poisonous obsession that had led him to kill Poppaea now compelled him to recreate her in flesh. He summoned his physicians, the finest surgeons in Rome, men who had treated generals wounded on the German front and senators crippled by age. But this was no battlefield injury they were asked to mend. It was an order that defied humanity itself. Nero commanded them to castrate Sporus. In Roman society, castration was not an accepted medical procedure. It was a punishment inflicted upon slaves in eastern provinces or young boys taken to become eunuch singers. The Romans themselves considered it barbaric, a violation of natural order. But Nero did not care. In his mind, nature existed to serve his will. If Sporus's body did not match the woman Nero saw in his mind, then it would be forcibly changed to fit it. Imagine Sporus that day, a teenage boy, barely grown into his own limbs, being led into the imperial surgical quarters, rooms echoing with marble coldness and incense, masking the smell of blood and metal. He was laid upon a stone table, held down by palace guards, their polished breastplates reflecting torchlight across the boy's terrified face. The physicians approached with their bronze scalpels and iron clamps. Ancient surgical techniques were primitive. Anesthesia was a cloth soaked in opium and wine, pressed against his nose until he drifted into semi-consciousness. But it did not block out the pain entirely. His screams would have filled the vaulted chambers, but none dared intervene. For hours they worked, slicing, clamping, burning the wounds to staunch bleeding, cauterizing flesh with hot irons. Every moment a desecration of his body, every breath a desperate prayer that death would come and end it. But Sporus did not die. When he woke days later, feverish with infection and pain, he no longer recognized the body beneath his sheets. The physicians had castrated him completely, removing any trace of his masculinity to mold him into what Nero demanded. He was no longer a boy in the eyes of Roman society. He was neither male nor female, an unclassifiable creature stripped of his original identity, and that was just the beginning. Nero named him Sabina after Poppaea Sabina, erasing the boy's birth name from the world. He was moved into new quarters within the imperial palace, chambers once reserved for the empress herself. Seamstresses arrived, carrying bolts of purple silk and sheer linen from Syria, fabric so fine they shimmered like liquid under lamplight. They measured his trembling body, pinched fabric to his shoulders and hips, whispering among themselves as they prepared his new wardrobe. Jewelers followed. They brought gold diadems, pearl earrings, emerald-studded necklaces, and rings heavy with amethyst and garnet. Many of these pieces had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Each ornament they clipped to his ears or clasped around his neck felt less, aka shackle, chaining him to the dead woman's image. But the transformation went deeper than clothes and jewels. Nero assigned cosmetic tutors to him, women skilled in the arts of Roman beauty. They taught Sporus how to outline his eyes with kohl, to shadow his lids with crushed malachite, to stain his lips with red ochre until they looked full and soft. They dusted his cheeks with chalk and vermilion powder to create Poppaea's signature pale flush. When he looked in the polished bronze mirror each morning, the face staring back at him was no longer his own. Hairdressers arrived daily. They washed his hair in scented oils from Arabia, curled it with heated iron rods, and arranged it in elaborate styles fashionable among imperial women. Braids woven into coiled buns pinned with ivory combs, gold thread braided through locks until his hair glittered in candlelight. Hours were spent each morning transforming him into an empress before he even stepped beyond his chamber doors. But perhaps the cruelest lessons were those of behavior. Sporus was assigned older noble women as tutors. They trained him in the art of feminine movement, how to walk with small measured steps, how to lower his gaze modestly when men approached, how to sit with his knees angled delicately, hands folded upon silk-draped laps. They taught him how to pour wine gracefully, how to smile without showing teeth, how to incline his head at the exact submissive angle Poppaea had perfected to soothe Nero's ego. Voice coaches worked with him daily, forcing him to pitch his voice higher, to adopt feminine inflections and patterns of speech. Every word he uttered was scrutinized and corrected until it sounded like Poppaea's soft, breathy manner of speaking. These lessons were not just about training, they were acts of psychological erasure. Every day, Sporus was forced to let go of who he was and become anything else entirely, a living doll carved and painted into the image of a dead woman. When Nero was finally satisfied with his creation, he announced something that shocked even the most decadent Roman aristocrats. He would marry Sporus in a full imperial wedding ceremony. Preparations began immediately. The palace erupted into a frenzy of activity as priests were summoned, musicians commissioned, seamstresses worked day and night to create wedding garments befitting an empress. Rumors swept Rome like wildfire. Senators whispered behind curtained litters. Noble women wept in secret at the grotesque spectacle about to unfold. But no one dared oppose it. Nero's word was law, and his madness was to be obeyed as if delivered by Jupiter himself. On the morning of the wedding, Sporus was dressed in a bridal gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread depicting Venus rising from the sea. Around his neck lay Poppaea's wedding necklace, pearls the size of dove's eggs strung upon woven gold. His hair was styled in the same bridal fashion Poppaea had worn at her own wedding years earlier, parted down the middle, curled in tight ringlets framing his face, pinned back beneath a sheer lace veil. As he was led into the imperial hall, hundreds of oil lamps flickered against the marble columns, casting trembling shadows across the floor. Petals of crimson roses drifted from balconies above as priests intoned sacred hymns. The scent of frankincense, myrrh, and burning cedar filled the vast chamber until the guests felt dizzy with its sweetness. Standing at the altar, in robes of imperial purple trimmed with leopard fur, was Nero. His eyes gleamed with manic triumph as he beheld Sporus walking towards him, each step echoing in that silent hall like a funeral drum. To the courtiers assembled, it was a scene so surreal it burned into their minds forever. Here was the Emperor of Rome marrying a teenage boy mutilated into the image of his dead wife, surrounded by priests chanting blessings, as if this union was sanctioned by the gods themselves. And to Nero, that is exactly what it was. He believed he had resurrected Poppaea, that the dead woman he killed had returned to him in a new form. When Sporus reached his side, trembling beneath layers of silk and jewels, Nero lifted his veil and whispered, "You are my goddess, return to me." The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows, offerings to Venus and Mars, signing of official marriage contracts, and blessings of fertility that rang hollow in the marble vaults. Musicians played flutes and lyres. Servants wept out of fear or pity. No one dared to refuse tears in the presence of an emperor lost in madness. And as Sporus looked up into Nero's feverish eyes, beneath the weight of perfume, jewels, and the gaze of hundreds, he felt something inside him crack and fall away forever. The wedding was only the beginning of Sporus's nightmare. From that day forward, he was no longer himself. In the eyes of Rome, he became Sabina, the Empress reborn. Nero treated him as a legitimate wife in every way, commanding him to sit beside him at banquets, to accompany him in the imperial litter on public processions, to sleep each night in the emperor's vast bedchamber beneath ceilings painted with celestial gods gazing down upon their grotesque union. Imagine the psychological torment of each dawn. Sporus awoke to walls draped in Poppaea's favorite silks, breathing in the same floral perfumes she once wore, seeing her golden statues, watching him with blind, impassive eyes. Servants entered to dress him, addressing him in feminine honorifics. "Domina," they whispered as they painted his lips, clasped his earrings, and adjusted his breastbands to flatten or shape what his body did not naturally have. Breakfast was served in gilded bowls on trays of lapis lazuli. Nero would sit across from him, gazing into his painted face with trembling adoration. "You are more beautiful now than ever," he would murmur, caressing Sporus's cheek with fingers still calloused from playing the cithara late into the night. To Sporus, these mornings felt like endless funerals for himself. Each word of praise buried his real identity deeper under the weight of jewels and lies. Public life was no kinder. Whenever Nero appeared at the theater, chariot races, or temples, Sporus sat beside him in full bridal regalia. The senators bowed to him as they would to an empress. Noble women curtsied, hiding their trembling revulsion behind painted smiles. Children stared openly, eyes wide with confusion, while merchants whispered prayers under their breath to ward off the evil eye. But no one spoke against it, because by then, Nero's reign had become a theater of fear and excess. At banquets, Sporus would pour wine for senators, moving with the precise grace drilled into him by his tutors. Nero would watch him perform these wifely duties, eyes shining with the same twisted pride a sculptor feels gazing upon his masterpiece. And each time Sporus lifted the wine jug, its heavy silver handle cutting into his palm, he wondered what would happen if he poured it over Nero's head and ended the charade in front of everyone. But he never did, because he knew he would not survive the attempt. At night, they dined alone in Nero's private chamber, surrounded by low-burning lamps that painted everything in golden gloom. Nero often insisted Sporus perform music for him, plucking a lyre with delicate, shaking fingers, while the emperor lay reclined on silken cushions, eyes half closed in intoxicated bliss. When Nero rose to join him, pressing his lips against Sporus's painted mouth, it felt less like a kiss and more like a tomb closing shut. Yet Sporus learned quickly that survival depended upon perfection. He trained himself to anticipate Nero's moods before they erupted into violence. He learned which words soothed the emperor's insecurities, which smiles seemed most like Poppaea's, and which silences gave Nero space to indulge his fantasies unchallenged. Historians write that Sporus became so adept at this performance that even seasoned courtiers began to doubt their own memories. Was this truly Sporus, the slave boy they once saw carrying scrolls through the marble halls? Or had Poppaea really returned, as Nero claimed, reincarnated in new flesh by the will of the gods? But beneath the makeup and silks, Sporus's mind was fracturing. Each day was a performance without an audience. Only the master, who demanded perfection at any cost, and with every mistake, every flicker of his old self that surfaced, he risked Nero's wrath. Because by this time, Nero's mind had descended into complete delusion. He no longer saw Sporus as a living being. He saw Poppaea, returned from the grave, his guilt absolved by her resurrection. When he kissed Sporus's lips, he whispered memories of nights he had shared with the real Poppaea, memories Sporus could only nod along to, inventing responses to stories he never lived. When Nero recounted the day he first met Poppaea, eyes glittering with drunken nostalgia, Sporus would smile softly, lowering his gaze. "Yes, my lord," he would whisper, "I remember." But inside, his true self screamed into a void no one could hear. And yet there were moments, fleeting, poisonous moments, when Sporus almost believed it himself, when he looked into the bronze mirror by lamplight and saw a beautiful woman staring back at him, hair curled and pinned with pearls, lips full and red, eyes outlined in smoky coal. For a heartbeat, he thought, perhaps this is who I am now. Perhaps Sporus never existed at all. But then the memory of his mother's voice would rise within him, whispering his birth name, a name no one ever spoke again, and he would feel a grief so deep it felt like drowning. Nero's obsession soon became too small for Rome alone. In 66 AD, he announced he would travel to Greece to display his artistic talents to the world. He fancied himself not just emperor, but master, musician, poet, and actor, a divine genius whose gifts demanded recognition beyond his own empire. The imperial caravan that set out for Greece was one of the most decadent spectacles in Roman history. Hundreds of litters carried musicians, dancers, actors, priests, slaves, soldiers, and courtiers. Thousands of wagons rolled across the stone roads, bearing amphorae of wine, barrels of salted fish, baskets overflowing with figs, dates, pomegranates, and meats cured in exotic spices. Gold and ivory statues were packed alongside Nero's personal performance wardrobe, silk robes, masks of tragic and comedic characters, and jeweled sandals that glittered like molten suns. And at the very front of this endless procession was Nero's litter, draped in Tyrian purple and embroidered with golden vines. Beside him, riding in a separate litter equally lavish, was Sporus. To the Greeks who gathered along the roads, it appeared as if the Emperor of Rome traveled with his radiant empress. But whispers quickly spread through the crowds. Some claimed she was a goddess incarnate. Others, sharper-eyed, whispered of unnatural unions and Roman decadence so extreme it mocked the gods themselves. At every city they entered, Corinth, Olympia, Athens, Nero performed in theaters packed with cheering Greeks commanded to adore him. Sporus sat in the imperial box, draped in white silk, pearls shimmering in torchlight, applauding with delicate hands painted crimson. From the stage, Nero would bow deeply to his wife Bee. Before beginning his performance, the crowd roaring their forced approval while priests chanted prayers to Apollo and Dionysus. Each night, as the empire slept beneath the Greek stars, Sporus lay beside Nero in their scented chambers, listening to the emperor whisper mad fantasies of how they would rule the world together forever as gods reborn. But even as Nero played God upon the Greek stage, the empire he ruled was rotting beneath him. Back in Rome, the Senate and the Praetorian Guard watched Nero's Greek Odyssey with mounting fury. While Nero sang for Greek nobles, racing chariots and acting tragedies, rebellions ignited across the provinces. Governors, outraged by his neglect of governance and endless taxation, raised legions against him. The empire's borders trembled under barbarian incursions, grain shipments faltered, the treasury sank under the weight of Nero's extravagance, silks from China, pearls from India, perfumes from Arabia, amphorae of rare wines emptied nightly to fuel his delusions. But Nero saw none of this. Each day, Sporus sat beside him as if nothing beyond their chamber walls existed. He was forced to applaud Nero's mediocre poetry, to weep at his overwrought tragedies, to marvel at his chariot victories carefully orchestrated to ensure he always won. At night, in private, Nero would hold him tightly and whisper, "My Sabina, do you see how they adore us? We are gods among mortals." And Sporus, whose ribs ached from the force of Nero's embraces, would nod and whisper, "Yes, my lord, they adore you." But deep inside, fear curdled into something darker, because Sporus could see what Nero could not. The haunted eyes of senators forced to praise his performances, the trembling hands of priests blessing his madness, the cold calculation in the eyes of generals who knew Rome could not endure this emperor much longer. By the spring of 68 AD, everything collapsed. When news arrived that Galba, governor of Hispania, had declared himself emperor with the Senate's blessing and the Praetorian Guard's support, Nero's delusion finally cracked. His entourage scattered like frightened birds. Loyalists deserted him overnight, fearing execution under the new regime. In the pre-dawn darkness, Nero fled Rome with only a handful of terrified attendants and Sporus. They rode hidden through moonlit olive groves to a small villa outside Rome owned by one of Nero's freedmen. The emperor, once master of the known world, cowered in a dusty cellar, clutching a worn cloak around his shaking shoulders, his golden diadem discarded upon the dirt floor. Sporus sat beside him, silent and still, in bridal silks, smeared with travel dust. He had not removed his empress attire because Nero demanded it, even in their final hours together. Through the night, Nero raved in whispered delirium. He spoke of escaping to Parthia to beg the Persian king for refuge. Then he imagined himself standing upon the rostra again, pleading forgiveness before the Senate, reclaiming power through tears and poetry. Then he collapsed into weeping despair, clutching Sporus against his chest. "They will take you from me," he whispered, tears soaking Sporus's veil. "They will burn me alive in the forum. But I will not let them have me. I will not let them take you." At dawn, news arrived that the Senate had declared him an enemy of Rome. Soldiers were marching to capture him alive. Nero rose, wiping his eyes, and ordered a servant to dig a grave. "For my burial," he explained, manic calm radiating from his gaunt face, "so they cannot desecrate my corpse." Then he turned to Sporus and smiled with devastating gentleness. "Would you weep for me, Sabina, as you did before?" Sporus nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment he saw a man who no longer knew where reality ended and madness began, a man so consumed by his own image that even death became an audience he needed to impress. Nero picked up a dagger from the servant's trembling hands. He pressed the blade to his throat but faltered, sobbing. Finally, as soldiers breached the villa's gates, he forced his personal secretary Epaphroditos to drive the dagger home. Blood gushed down his purple robes, pooling upon the dusty stone floor. Nero gasped a final ragged breath, eyes staring upwards, still seeing himself as a god. And then, Rome's last Julio-Claudian emperor was gone. But for Sporus, death did not bring freedom. The Praetorian Guard seized him along with the other attendants. In the chaos of regime change, his fate became a dark currency passed from one powerful man to another. First, Nymphidius Sabinus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, claimed Sporus for himself. Like Nero, he forced the boy to dress in bridal silks and address him as "my husband," mocking the dead emperor's madness while indulging in it himself. When Nymphidius fell to assassination mere months later, Sporus was taken by Otho, then by Vitellius, each man using him as a trophy of conquest, each forcing him to continue the charade Nero had begun, each calling him Sabina, each demanding the performance of an empress in private chambers, dark with the stench of power and fear. Imagine the horror of these days. No longer even the beloved doll of a mad emperor, he became a nameless concubine, passed from hand to hand, each new master peeling away whatever fragments of self he had managed to hide within. But under Vitellius, his torment reached its final grotesque crescendo. The new emperor, known for his gluttony and sadism, announced his intention to display Sporus in a public spectacle at the Colosseum. The boy was to play the role of Proserpina, the maiden goddess abducted by Pluto in a theat. Recall reenactment that ended with her brutal rape and symbolic death? For Sporus, this was the end of all hope. The idea of being publicly violated and killed for mass entertainment broke what remained of his spirit. In the quiet hours before the spectacle, surrounded by palace guards and weeping eunuch attendants, Sporus made his final choice. He obtained poison, perhaps gifted by a sympathetic slave or priestess, and swallowed it alone in his chamber. There, upon the marble floor, veined with red like pulsing wounds, dressed in Poppeia's pearls and silks he never chose, Sporus died. He was barely 20 years old. Sporus's death should have been the end of his torment, but even in death, Rome refused to grant him dignity. Historians recorded his final moments with cold detachment, describing him merely as Nero's castrated boy-wife, the tragic footnote to an emperor's madness. No prayers were sung for him, no funeral rites were offered to guide his spirit across the silent rivers of the underworld. His body, adorned in bridal silks he never chose, was likely burned or discarded without ceremony, his ashes swept away with the refuse of Rome's decadent palaces. For the senators and generals who read the reports, he was little more than a curiosity, another example of Nero's depravity, a warning of what happened when emperors lost all moral restraint. They spoke his name in disgust or mockery, never with compassion. But imagine for a moment the truth of who he was. Beneath the layers of silks, beneath the painted rouge and darkened eyes, beneath the forced feminine gestures and the hollow voice trained to mimic Poppeia's softness, there remained a boy who once ran through the marble corridors of the imperial palace carrying scrolls for senators, who laughed with other slaves in hidden courtyards while they washed linens and swept floors, a boy who studied his letters by lamplight, dreaming perhaps of earning a position as an imperial scribe or steward. An unremarkable life, but one of quiet dignity and choice. That boy was murdered long before his final breath. Each day under Nero's gaze stripped him of identity until only a puppet remained, an exquisite doll shaped by imperial command. We do not know Sporus's true name. History erased it along with his dreams. The name Sporus itself was a cruel joke. It means seed or spore, referencing a slave's inability to produce legitimate heirs. Nero's final cruelty was to rename him Sabina after the wife he killed, erasing even the bitter nickname he had carried since birth. But there were moments, fleeting as candle flickers, when Sporus's hidden self must have cried out in agony. When Nero lay asleep, breathing heavily beside him, perhaps Sporus stared into the darkness, clutching the thin thread of who he once was, remembering his mother's voice, or the games he played as a child before the empire devoured him, because despite everything, he remained human. He felt fear when Nero summoned the surgeons to destroy his body. He felt terror when forced into wedding silks before all of Rome. He felt shame as senators bowed before him in forced reverence. He felt grief so profound it threatened to annihilate his mind each morning when he looked into the mirror and saw a stranger's face gazing back. But most of all, he felt rage. Rage that no one, not even the gods, intervened to save him from this nightmare. Rage that his life became a theater for the mad ambitions of powerful men. Rage that his death would be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a decadent anecdote whispered at drunken banquets for centuries to come. Yet, in the end, Sporus claimed the only act of agency left to him, his own death. When he swallowed the poison, perhaps he did so with trembling hands. Perhaps tears streamed down his painted cheeks, dissolving coal into dark streaks upon his skin. Perhaps he whispered his birth name one final time, tasting its syllables like honey before the bitter sting of oblivion closed his throat. Or perhaps he felt nothing at all, just the relief of silence after years of forced music, forced laughter, forced love. His death was not only an escape, it was a defiance, a refusal to submit his body to public degradation one final time. In taking his own life, Sporus seized the decision that Nero and Rome had stolen from him since childhood, the choice over his own fate. In that silent, lonely chamber, as his vision darkened and the distant city drums faded, Sporus became more than Nero's doll, more than Rome's spectacle. He became what he was always meant to be, himself, if only for a few quiet heartbeats before death claimed him. Today, we tell his story not because it is entertaining, but because it is human. Beneath the grandeur of marble temples, golden statues, and imperial pageantry, there lived people like Sporus, slaves, concubines, prisoners, and pawns, whose pain formed the unseen foundation upon which empires built their glory. His life reminds us that every time we read the histories of kings and emperors, we must remember the silent multitudes crushed beneath their feet. His suffering remains a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the small, enduring spark of human dignity that even absolute power cannot fully extinguish. For in the end, Sporus chose to die as himself, not as Nero's empress. He chose silence over performance. He chose darkness over the blinding lights of Rome's eternal stage. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet realm beyond life and history, his soul walks freely at last, unpainted, unadorned, unbound, carrying only his true name, whispered like a secret to the gods who failed him in life.